Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling said about Megan O'Brien, 3 years into her tenure at Mercy General Norfolk, standing at the nursing station with a coffee mug that read "World's Okayest Mom" in fading letters. He didn't know. He had no idea who was standing 3 feet away, restocking the trauma cart with the methodical precision of someone who'd done it in dust storms outside Tikrit with rounds coming in hot. She'd been invisible for exactly 1,096 days. The invisibility was intentional. Megan O'Brien moves through the emergency department's trauma bay at 0130 hours, fluorescent lights buzzing their mechanical hymn overhead, the sharp tang of antiseptic mixing with something copper and ancient in the recirculated air. Her scrubs are navy blue, unremarkable. Her badge clipped at hip level reads Megan O'Brien, RN, in modest white lettering. Nobody sees the hands. Scarred along the knuckles, old burns, the kind you acquire when hot brass casings eject past your grip during a live-fire drill in a compound where the perimeter is thin and the enemy is creative about breaches. Her left hand touches the inside of her jacket where it hangs on the break room hook, where a small square bulge sits sewn beneath the fabric lining. The faded unit patch. SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. The call sign stitched underneath reads Reaper in letters that have faded to near invisibility. 8 years of carrying it. 8 years of nobody asking questions. Dr. Sterling observes her from behind the nursing station counter. He's 53, carries himself with the kind of posture that comes from private schools and country club memberships, the type of man who wears a Rolex that costs more than most nurses make in a month and somehow still feels like he's being shortchanged. His teeth are veneered to an unsettling whiteness. When he speaks to the junior resident beside him, his voice carries the careful disdain of someone explaining why certain people are simply wired differently. O'Brien's competence is her ceiling, not her foundation, he says, watching as Megan efficiently preps Trauma Bay 2, her movements economical, nothing wasted, nothing rushed. She thinks showing up every shift, doing the work, that translates to ambition. It doesn't. She's content being middle management. Some nurses are born leaders. O'Brien was born to follow orders. The resident nods. He's new enough to believe hierarchy means intelligence. He's new enough to not understand that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one holding everyone else's life in her hands. Megan moves to the medication cabinet, her fingers finding the correct drawer by muscle memory alone. 3 years at Mercy General. Before that, 8 years she doesn't discuss. Before that, a life that ended the moment she walked into the Pentagon's psychiatric evaluation office and told the evaluator that the faces were stopping, the nightmares were stopping, the trembling was stopping, but she couldn't be trusted with classified protocols anymore because sometimes her hands moved before her mind caught up, and in her line of work, that meant bodies ended up in places they shouldn't. She'd rebuilt herself piece by careful piece. She'd become someone without a past. She'd become someone who could heal without carrying the weight of who she'd been. The choice had cost her a marriage, a house in Alexandria, a pension she'd never collect, and the ability to see 3 of her closest friends without legal paperwork preventing it. The trade-off had been Danny. Her son. She'd gotten her son back because she'd become someone safe to stand next to again. The ambulance radio crackles to life. Dispatch voice, efficient and flat, Mercy General, we have an incoming trauma. Male, 57 years old, Coast Guard training accident. Multiple shrapnel wounds, penetrating injuries to left flank and right shoulder. Vitals currently stable but deteriorating. ETA 6 minutes. Sterling immediately moves into performance mode. This is the part he loves, the crisis that justifies his presence, the moment where he gets to direct traffic and make decisions that sound medically complex but are actually protocol-driven. He calls out to the attending, who appears within seconds. He checks the trauma bay assignments. He's a competent administrator. Nobody would argue that. His competence is why he's being considered for chief of medicine, why the board takes his calls, why the hospital's upper management thinks he represents a vision of leadership that works. Megan reaches for the trauma cart and begins moving supplies with the precision of someone who's done this under actual fire. 14-gauge angiocath needles. Pressure dressings. 2 liters of whole blood pre-typed from the bank. The movements are automatic. The breathing is steady. She runs through the mental checklist that's kept her alive through 3 tours and counting the ways this night might go wrong, how many steps she'll need to cut, what protocols might need to bend if the patient arrives in worse shape than dispatch indicated. Sterling approaches her as she's loading the final supplies. His voice carries the tone of someone conferring with a competent subordinate. Get Bay 2 ready. Standard trauma protocol. Nothing complicated, just make sure the lines are clean and the equipment doesn't fail. Can you manage that, or do I need to reassign? Megan nods without looking at him. Bay 2 is ready, Dr. Sterling. Good. He pauses, studying her face. You know, competence is necessary but insufficient in emergency medicine. You need the killer instinct. The willingness to make aggressive calls. That's what separates the directors from the operators. You understand the distinction. She understands perfectly. She understands that he sees a woman who flinches at authority, who accepts insults without bristling, who doesn't push back. She understands that her invisibility has become her liability in his eyes. She understands that in a professional hierarchy, being underestimated is a form of erasure. She nods again. I'll be watching, he adds, and something in the way he says it carries the weight of assessment. The ambulance arrives 4 minutes later. The bay doors burst open with the organized chaos that trauma professionals have trained into muscle memory. The paramedics are moving fast but controlled. The stretcher comes through with a man who's grey at the temples and conscious, which is good, which means his airway is intact and his bleeding hasn't reached the point where blood loss has triggered the body's final shutdown sequence. Megan moves toward him with the calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She's read the chart they're calling in, Commander Marcus Hayes, Coast Guard Operations, Training Accident during Demolition Exercises. The moment her eyes find his face, everything stops. She knows this man. She'd know him in a crowd of 500. She'd know him in the dark. She'd know him if she never heard his voice again. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hayes. Danny's commanding officer. The man who'd written her the letter, 8 years ago, that said her son had shown exceptional promise and a natural aptitude for leadership and that Hayes himself would be honored to mentor him through his career trajectory. The man who, once a year, sends Danny a handwritten note on his birthday. Her hand freezes on the trauma cart handle for exactly 1 second. 1 second. Her breathing doesn't change. Her face doesn't change. The micro-expression flickers and disappears before most people would notice. But Dr. Sterling is watching. He sees the hesitation. He sees the moment where composure fractures, just barely, just for an instant. Sterling's wife, Rachel, is in the bay entrance. She's dressed in the kind of casual elegance that comes from a military spouse who knows how to present herself at hospital waiting rooms. She sees the same hesitation. She sees Megan's hand pause. Her eyes go wide with something that might be hope or might be terror, depending on what she's been told about her husband's condition. My husband, Rachel says, moving toward the stretcher. Is he? What's happening? Sterling moves into the space between Megan and the patient with the smooth precision of a man who's been waiting for exactly this moment. His voice rises, carries, reaches the ears of the 2 residents and 3 nursing students who are present in and around the trauma bay. His voice carries the kind of theatrical concern that masks contempt perfectly. Brian, he says, and the name alone sounds like an indictment. If you're too rattled for basic triage, perhaps you belong in a clinic. Somewhere the stakes are lower and your emotional responses won't compromise patient care. We need people in this trauma bay who can function under pressure. The words land like shrapnel. Rachel Hayes flinches. The residents look away. The nursing students suddenly find their shoes very interesting. Megan's jaw tightens, just barely perceptible, just the kind of muscle tension that suggests she's made a decision about how to respond, and that decision is to not respond at all. She steps back from the trauma cart. She removes herself from the patient's immediate space. She does not cry. She does not argue. She does not defend herself. Her composure is the terrifying kind that comes from having been trained to absorb punishment and return to functional status, because in her previous life, breaking down meant people died. Commander Hayes is watching all of this unfold. His eyes move from Megan to Sterling with the kind of clarity that comes from consciousness and pain and the sudden awareness that his medical team is experiencing internal conflict. "What's the hold-up?" he asks, his voice rough but commanding. "Get me stabilized or get me transferred." Sterling springs into action. This is his moment. This is where he gets to be the director, the decision-maker, the man in charge. He barks orders that are perfectly reasonable, perfectly appropriate, perfectly designed to make him look like the professional in the room and Megan look like she lost her composure in front of a high-ranking military officer. Rachel Hayes watches the whole thing, and her face cycles through confusion and then something harder, anger, maybe, or the dawning realization that her husband has just been seen by the trauma team at a moment when that trauma team is fracturing from within. What Sterling doesn't understand, the thing he's incapable of seeing, is that Megan's hesitation had nothing to do with rattled nerves. Her hesitation was the precise moment where past and present collided. Her hesitation was the space between who she'd been and who she'd become. Her hesitation lasted exactly 1 second, and then she was operational again, because 8 years of training doesn't disappear because a ghost from your former life shows up on a stretcher. Sterling's motivation runs deeper than simple cruelty, though the cruelty is real. He's 53 years old and lobbying hard for the chief of medicine position. The hospital board values hierarchy above all else. They value clear chain of command, decisive authority structures, the kind of leadership that sits at the top and delegates downward. What they don't value, what they're actively threatened by, is the kind of informal authority that grows when nurses like Megan move through a trauma bay and suddenly the doctors are listening, suddenly the residents are watching, suddenly the decision-making becomes collaborative instead of hierarchical. Nurses who have that kind of presence, that kind of instinctive knowledge of what needs to happen next, they undermine the very structure that elevates men like Sterling to leadership. They suggest that maybe the hierarchy isn't necessary. They suggest that maybe the quietest person in the room might know something important. Sterling has spent 20 years building a career on the assumption that authority is a function of title. Megan represents the possibility that he's been wrong about that. So he needs to diminish her. He needs to make her small, keep her small, remind her, and remind everyone watching, that regardless of her competence, she remains subordinate. What he doesn't know is that the man on the stretcher is about to change everything. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular silence that comes when people stop talking mid-sentence. Megan pushed open the door at 0600, still in scrubs dark with other people's blood, looking for her lunch bag tucked in the corner where it always was. 4 nurses sat at the plastic table. They saw her. One by one, they stood without a word and left. Their chairs scraped backward like they were scraping her away. Nobody met her eyes. By 0800, the unit board outside Trauma Bay 2 had new paper on it. White. Official. Megan's name in bold, RNM O'Brien. Incident report. The word sat there like a diagnosis. Emotional unsuitability for emergency medicine. Froze during critical triage. Insubordinate response to correction. The font was serifed and cold and impossible to miss. A junior resident stopped in front of it, coffee in hand. His eye scanned the notice. Then he smiled, a small, satisfied smile, and stage whispered to an intern beside him, "Nurse Shaky finally got caught." Megan was 2 feet away. Close enough to hear the vowels stretch. Close enough to watch the resident's shoulders relax into the comfortable posture of someone who'd just been granted permission to be cruel. She took one measured breath. The air moved through her nose and filled her chest, the kind of breath you learn in places where breathing loud gets you killed. She reached forward, touched the notice with 2 fingers, and removed it from the board. Folded it once. Her hands moved like surgical instruments, precise and without tremor. She placed it in her pocket. Then she looked at the junior resident. Just looked. The smile died on his face like a candle in a room that had suddenly gone airless. "I've stitched men back together in places you couldn't find on a map," she said. Her voice didn't rise. Didn't crack. Didn't carry anger or hurt or anything except the weight of absolute fact. Places where the sand gets in your wounds and the infection sets in before the morphine clears your system. Places where you keep working because the alternative is watching them die on the table in front of you. She turned and walked toward Trauma Bay 1. Behind her, she heard nothing. The hallway had collapsed into that particular quiet that follows when someone says something they shouldn't have said and a stranger answers in a voice that sounds like it's been forged in somewhere else entirely. The cafeteria at 1100 smelled like industrial gravy and something that had been reheated too many times. Megan sat alone at a corner table, her lunch untouched, a salad she'd prepped for days ago, the edges of the lettuce beginning to brown. Two medical students approached the table. She watched them see her. Watched the calculation happen behind their eyes. They redirected without speaking, pulling out chairs 15 feet away at an empty table that suddenly seemed very important. Nobody sat with Megan O'Brien anymore. She ate the brown lettuce anyway. The texture was all wrong, soft where it should have been crisp. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was watching people she'd trained, nurses she'd mentored through their first codes, pretend she'd become invisible. One of them, a woman named Rodriguez, had been shadowing Megan for 3 weeks before Dr. Sterling's notice went up. Rodriguez had called Megan during a patient crash, asking how to read the monitor strip. Megan had talked her through it, calm and methodical, and Rodriguez had gotten the medication in at exactly the right time and the patient's heart had recovered. Now Rodriguez wouldn't make eye contact in the hallway. Cowardice looked different on different faces, but it always looked the same. At 1300, in an office on the 3rd floor with a door that closed and windows that didn't open, Dr. Sterling was making phone calls. Megan didn't know this yet. She was in records, filing discharge summaries, because that's where Sterling had moved her that morning. Documentation duty, he'd said, loud enough for 6 staff members to hear. Until the review concludes, you'll be in records. For everyone's protection. He'd handed her a stack of folders like she was a file clerk with a pulse. Sterling's voice on the phone was different with Patricia low. Softer. Networked. Patricia, I need your support on a personnel matter. Patient safety issue with one of the nursing staff. I'd appreciate your voice on the board. There was a contract in those words, tenure votes for Patricia's daughter in exchange for Patricia's authority wielded on his behalf. He made 3 calls in 18 minutes. The second was to Janet Keller in HR. Janet, we may need an outside investigation. Liability concerns. I'd hate for something to escalate beyond our ability to manage it. Janet's daughter had graduated from medical school. Janet owed him. Janet knew she owed him. The third was to Dr. Marcus Wendell at Virginia Medical Board, someone Sterling had met at a conference in 2019. Marcus, hypothetically, if a nurse performed procedures beyond scope without appropriate supervision, what would that look like from a regulatory standpoint? He was building something that didn't look like retaliation. It looked like protocol. It looked like process. It looked inevitable. That afternoon, Megan's phone rang. The number was local. When she answered, the voice belonged to her son. Mom, can you make dinner Friday? Commander Hayes is back from that training thing. Megan's hand trembled. Not from fear. From recognition. From the weight of something she'd buried 8 years ago suddenly becoming solid and real and present in the same building where she was trying to disappear. Danny, she said. Your commander was in an accident. He's here. He's stable. The line went quiet in the way that means someone's world is reorganizing itself. I'm coming down there. No, Megan said. Her voice had returned to its controlled register, the one without cracks. Stay on base. I'll handle it. But she wouldn't handle it. That was the thing nobody understood. You can handle a trauma bay. You can handle a patient crashing. You can handle blood and pain and the 1,000 small choices that mean the difference between someone going home and someone going to a funeral. You cannot handle the past walking through the doors with a wife crying behind him and your son's voice in your ear asking why his mother had just gone pale on the phone. At 1600, Megan left Mercy General through the staff parking lot. The November air was cold against her skin. Her scrubs were still damp with sweat from the shift. She got in her car, a 2009 Subaru with 178,000 miles and a missing side mirror, and drove home to a house that smelled like nothing, decorated like nobody actually lived there. She sat at the kitchen table in her scrubs at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, still wearing the name badge that said RN, and opened the envelope that had been waiting in her mailbox. Termination of employment. Effective immediately pending final HR review. Her hands didn't shake. That was the thing about Senior Chief Petty Officer training. About Tikrit. About learning that the people you trust most can leave you, and you still have to go to work the next day. Your hands don't shake. Your voice doesn't crack. You sit at a kitchen table in damp scrubs and read the words that mean your identity, the one you've been building for 8 years, the one that said you were just a nurse, just a person, just someone trying to heal without being healed, has been dismantled by a man who couldn't survive 5 minutes in a room where the real stakes were people's lives. Outside, the rain began to fall. Not a drizzle. A statement. The kind of rain that sounds like something insisting on being heard. The rain that started at midnight had turned the parking lot into a mirror, and Dr. Sterling stood at the window of Administrator Vaughan's office on the 4th floor, watching it reflect the sodium lights below like scattered coins. Behind him, Vaughan sat with his fingers steepled on an empty desk, the kind of emptiness that meant paperwork had been cleared for a conversation that needed no witnesses beyond these 2 walls. Sterling had called the meeting for 1300, and he'd been precise about the timing. A Wednesday afternoon. After morning rounds, before evening shift. The kind of hour when phones stopped ringing and the hospital settled into its administrative wait. The chief of medicine position, Sterling began, still facing the window, requires someone who understands institutional hierarchy. Someone who commands it. Not someone who threatens to democratize it. He turned. His voice carried the tone of someone explaining mathematics to a child. Nurses who think they can perform invasive cardiac procedures without physician oversight. That's not medicine, Richard. That's chaos. Vaughan nodded slowly. He was the kind of administrator who'd learned to agree in silence. I've been thinking about the pericardiocentesis, Sterling continued. He moved to the chair across from Vaughan with the fluid confidence of a man who knew every door in the building opened for him. Commander Hayes needed intervention. I granted it. But the way O'Brien acted, the autonomy she assumed, that's a problem that goes beyond one nurse's judgment call. The outcome was positive, Vaughan offered carefully. This time, Sterling said. But what about next time? What about the time she makes a mistake because she's operating outside her scope? He leaned forward. What message does that send to every other nurse in this hospital? That protocols don't matter if you're confident enough. That hierarchy is negotiable. The fluorescent lights hummed above them, steady and white. I'm calling the Virginia Medical Board, Sterling said. Dr. Helen Cross. She's the lead consultant for peer review investigations. I've worked with her before, thorough woman, respects institutional structure. He paused. I'm also activating a few other resources. Vaughan straightened slightly. Other resources? Board member Castellano owes me a tenure vote from 2 years ago. I helped his daughter get into Johns Hopkins. The HR director, Patricia, her daughter got into my mentorship program. These people understand loyalty. Sterling's smile was the kind that never reached his eyes. And I'm documenting everything. Every instance of O'Brien operating beyond standard nursing scope. Every time she made a medical decision without explicit physician authorization. There are hundreds of nurses who. Not like O'Brien, Sterling interrupted. She's the dangerous kind. Quiet. Competent. The kind that makes people forget there's a hierarchy in place. The kind that makes boards question whether they need physicians at all, if someone can just intuit their way through cardiac emergencies. Vaughan said nothing. The silence was the sound of a man realizing he'd already lost the argument before it started. "I want her gone," Sterling said. "Not just reassigned. Gone. But we do it correctly. We do it through channels. We gather evidence. We involve the board. We make it impossible for her to claim she was wronged." He stood. The meeting was over. It had lasted for minutes. Dr. Helen Cross arrived at Mercy General at 0900 on Thursday morning, and she moved through the hospital with the particular gravity of someone conducting an official investigation. She was 62, wore a navy blazer that cost more than most residents made in a month, and carried a leather folder that contained nothing but seemed to contain everything. Sterling met her at the administrative entrance and walked her through the corridors with the ease of a man showing a guest through his own home. The incident occurred at approximately 0230, Sterling explained as they moved past the trauma bays. "Commander Hayes, Coast Guard, shrapnel wounds. Standard presentation, nothing unusual." But Nurse O'Brien, without waiting for cardiothoracic authorization, performed a needle pericardiocentesis. Invasive cardiac intervention. Beyond her scope. Cross made a note. Her handwriting was precise, the letters angled like military formations. "Did the physician authorize the procedure?" she asked. "I was occupied with imaging and surgical consultation." O'Brien made an autonomous decision based on intuition, I suppose. Competence, certainly. But competence doesn't replace protocol. They reached the nursing station. Several nurses looked up, then quickly looked away. The message had already traveled through the hospital like a current. The medical board was here about O'Brien. The investigation was official now. Whatever happened next would happen through channels that couldn't be appealed. Cross spent the morning interviewing staff. She spoke to 3 residents, 2 attending physicians, 4 nurses. Each conversation lasted exactly 18 minutes. Each one, Sterling had ensured, included someone who would testify that O'Brien operated independently. That she assumed authority. That she made medical decisions without proper authorization. The nurses who might have defended her, who knew that pericardiocentesis was within an experienced trauma nurse's scope in a life-or-death situation, said nothing. They'd seen the write-up. They understood the direction the wind was blowing. At 1100, Megan was called to a conference room on the 2nd floor. The kind of room with a window that faced the parking lot and a table made of laminate that looked like wood from a distance. Sterling was already there, settled into the middle chair like it was his throne. Vaughan sat to his left. Dr. Cross sat to his right, with her leather folder closed and her hands folded on top of it like a judge's. Megan entered and closed the door. There were no other chairs at the table. She remained standing. "Nurse O'Brien," Cross began, her voice carrying the polished tone of someone accustomed to having her words recorded and reviewed. "I'm Dr. Helen Cross, Virginia Medical Board. I'm here to discuss the cardiac intervention you performed on Commander Marcus Hayes on the night of March 11th. Megan said nothing. Her jaw had tightened, just a small movement, visible to anyone who knew how to look. Sterling was looking. He always looked. "Walk me through your training," Cross continued. "Critical cardiac interventions. Who certified you? What's your scope of practice?" "Advanced Cardiac Life Support Certification," Megan said. Her voice was steady, pitched low. "Trauma nursing. 12 years experience, pre-hospital and hospital settings." "But not invasive cardiac procedures," Sterling interjected. His voice carried the reasonable tone of someone correcting a misunderstanding. "Helen, to clarify, O'Brien has standard RN credentials. No advanced certifications on file for emergency cardiac intervention." Megan's eyes moved to him. "Just for a moment." "Long enough." "I'm ACLS certified," she said. "I'm also trained in emergency cardiac procedures including needle decompression, needle pericardiocentesis, and emergency cricothyrotomy. Those certifications are in my file." Dr. Sterling has access to my file. Cross made another note. And who authorized the pericardiocentesis on Commander Hayes? Commander Hayes was in cardiac tamponade, Megan said. His systolic blood pressure was 72 and dropping. Pericardiocentesis is the indicated treatment for pericardial effusion when surgery isn't available. It's a life-saving procedure. I performed it. Under whose authorization? Sterling asked. Under emergency medical necessity, Megan said. Her voice didn't change. It was still low, still steady. It was the voice of someone who had done this before. Someone who had saved lives before. Someone who understood that protocols were written by people who had never heard a man's heartbeat disappearing under their hands. The patient was dying. The procedure was indicated. I performed it. Without physician oversight, Sterling said. I notified you immediately upon completion, Megan said. The pressure curve flattened. 60 ccs of pericardial blood. The patient stabilized. You arrived 7 minutes later. Cross was still writing. Her handwriting never paused, never hesitated. It was mechanical, efficient, removing any judgment from the act of recording. Thank you, Nurse O'Brien, Cross said, without looking up. That will be all. Megan turned and left. The door closed behind her with the soft sound of something final. At 1400, Megan was called to Sterling's office. This time, Vaughan was present. This time, there was a folder on Sterling's desk, not the leather one, but a medical record folder with her name on the tab. O'Brien, M. We've completed the preliminary investigation, Sterling said. His voice carried no satisfaction, no anger. It was the voice of someone discussing whether. The consensus is that while your intentions were sound, your actions exceeded the appropriate scope of nursing practice. Performing an invasive cardiac procedure without explicit physician authorization represents a significant deviation from hospital protocol and state nursing standards. Megan stood. Vaughan Saturday. Sterling occupied the space between them like a line that couldn't be crossed. Effective immediately, you're being placed on administrative leave pending full review by the hospital board, Sterling continued. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was printed on official letterhead. The word swam a little, not because her eyes were unfocused, but because the room had gone slightly quiet in that way rooms go when something fundamental shifts. Your building access will be suspended. You'll need to return your badge and access card. You'll be contacted within 5 business days regarding the outcome of the formal review. Megan picked up the paper. The words were clear enough. Administrative leave. Pending investigation. Preliminary termination notice. The phrase that meant everything was conditional now. Everything was suspended. Everything was waiting for the hammer to fall. Do you have any questions? Sterling asked. She didn't. Or if she did, they weren't the kind that could be answered in this office, in this room, with these 2 men watching her like scientists observing a specimen that had finally stopped moving. She drove home at 1500 on a Tuesday in a car that still smelled like the hospital, antiseptic and something else, something like resignation. The scrubs she wore had been blue this morning. By afternoon, they felt grey. The house was quiet when she arrived. The kitchen table sat in its usual place. The chair across from it sat in its usual place. She sat down and placed the termination notice on the table, and she looked at it the way you might look at something that had landed in your home from outer space. Something that didn't belong here but was unmistakably real. Her hands were steady. This was important. In this moment, while her career was collapsing in a hospital 4 miles away, her hands needed to be steady. She placed them on the table. Palms down. Steady. The rain started again at 15:20, and by 15:30, when Danny came through the front door in his dress blues, the world outside the kitchen window had become entirely water, sky and street and light all merged into something formless and grey. He saw her first. Then he saw the scrubs at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. Then he saw her face, which was still composed, still steady, still held together like a structure that had learned to support itself through sheer will. "Mom," he said. "Why are you home?" She opened her mouth. The words didn't come. What came instead was something worse, the recognition in her own eyes that the life she had built here, the identity she had constructed as someone without a past, as someone who could heal without being haunted, had just been dismantled by a man in a hospital who understood that true power wasn't the ability to help people. True power was the ability to prevent them from helping themselves. "I did my job," she said finally. Danny came to the table and sat down. He looked at the paper, at the letterhead, at the words that meant everything was ending. "What happened?" he asked. The rain hammered the windows like something insisting on being heard. At 0200, the phone rang. Blocked number. Megan didn't answer. It rang again. Then a third time. She sat in the dark of her bedroom, still in scrubs, watching the glow light up the nightstand. On the fourth ring, she picked up. "Megan." Kelly's voice was a whisper, frantic. "Megan, don't speak. Just listen. Hayes is crashing. Pericardial tamponade, they think. There's a fragment they missed. Sterling's here and he's panicking. Cardiothoracic is 20 minutes out. Maybe 25. I shouldn't be calling, but..." Megan was already moving. She hung up, grabbed her jacket, the one with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, and was in her car before she'd finished the sentence. Mercy General sat across Norfolk like a ship in dry dock, its lights harsh against the pre-dawn dark. She used the loading dock entrance where her badge still worked on the exterior doors. The system hadn't updated yet. Whoever was supervising terminations had been too efficient with paperwork, too slow with access codes. The ICU screamed before she reached it. Alarms. Overhead pages. The particular chaos of a body failing faster than medicine could catch. Hayes lay in Bay 7, his monitor flatlined, nurses bagging him with mechanical precision. Sterling stood 4 feet away, phone pressed to his ear, voice like a tank idling in a garage, low and dangerous. "Where is the thoracic? Get them here now. Tell them ETA is critical." Rachel Hayes sat collapsed in a corner chair, both hands pressed against her mouth. Megan didn't knock. She pushed through the glass doors and moved to the bedside in 7 seconds flat. "I can do this now," she said. Sterling spun. His face was the color of old hospital linoleum. "You are on leave. Security. Get her." Megan was already prepping the pericardiocentesis kit. Needle. Sterile field. Her hand steady as surgical lasers, moving through a sequence she'd performed in a dust storm outside Tikrit while mortars fell like hail. There was no hesitation. No tremor. Just muscle memory dressed in muscle. "Step back," she said. It wasn't a request. She located the xiphoid process, the anatomical landmark beneath his sternum, angled the needle toward his left shoulder at 45 degrees, and advanced through the fibrous pericardial sac. The needle slid in like a key finding its lock. 60 ccs of blood flowed into the syringe, dark and urgent. The moment the pressure released, the monitor screen shifted. 2 seconds of silence. Then the beep. Normal sinus rhythm. Hayes gasped. His oxygen saturation climbed. 84, 87. 91. Sterling stood frozen, watching a nurse he'd tried to destroy save the life he was prepared to lose. Megan set the syringe down with the care of someone placing a loaded weapon on a table. She didn't look at Sterling. She didn't look at Rachel Hayes. She changed the 4 line with the same methodical precision, checked the monitor again, and stepped back. "He's stable," she said. "Cardiothoracic will confirm, but the pressure's off." Sterling's mouth moved. No words came out. By 0700, the emergency peer review was convened in conference room C. Sterling, Vaughan, Dr. Cross, and Patricia Lowe from the hospital board. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Someone had brought coffee. Nobody touched it. Sterling opened a file folder with fingers that looked like they belonged to someone else. At 0215 this morning, Ms. O'Brien entered this facility while on administrative leave pending investigation. She accessed the ICU without authorization and performed an invasive cardiac procedure, a pericardiocentesis, without supervision, without attending physician oversight, without any documentation of qualified supervision. She practiced medicine without a license. This is grounds for immediate termination and formal complaint to the Virginia Medical Board. Dr. Vaughn glanced at Patricia Lowe. Patricia Lowe stared at the folder. The patient survived, Vaughn said quietly. That's irrelevant, Sterling said. Protocol exists regardless of outcome. If we allow this, we've compromised every standard of practice in this hospital. Every hierarchy. Every chain of command. Patricia Lowe closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Then she nodded. By 0900, the termination notice was in Megan's hands. Final. Effective immediately. Virginia Medical Board formal complaint filed. Grounds: practicing beyond scope of licensure. Unsupervised invasive procedure. Administrative insubordination. She sat in her car in the parking lot, hands gripping the steering wheel with the same strength that had held lives together in places that didn't appear on maps. The steering wheel was cold. The parking lot was empty. She screamed once, raw and silent, just air and rage and the sound of everything she'd rebuilt collapsing like a structure that had only ever been temporary. Then she stopped. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She started the car and drove home. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Commander Marcus Hayes regained full consciousness at 1100, and his first words were to ask where she was. The afternoon shift called her back to close documentation under Sterling's direct supervision. Protocol. Oversight. The irony was so sharp Megan could taste it like copper. She changed Hayes's for with hands that trembled slightly, the first time anyone would have seen her tremble, because she understood now that Sterling had won. The hospital had won. The hierarchy had won. Hayes's eyes opened and found her face. He didn't blink. He went completely rigid, like a man who'd seen a ghost. Reaper, he whispered. The word hung in the space between them like something dropped from a height. Sterling stood in the doorway, frowning. He didn't understand the reference. He didn't understand anything that mattered. Hayes struggled to sit up, his full line pulling tight. You. Tickrit. Your senior chief, his voice cracked. Danny walked in 3 seconds later in dress uniform, visiting during his lunch break, visiting the commander he reported to, stepping into a room where something was being said that rewrote every assumption his mother had made about her own invisibility. He saw Hayes staring at his mother. He saw her frozen. He read the room the way a military officer reads a battlefield. So, Danny said. Hayes locked eyes with him. Your mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien. She carried me 2 miles through enemy fire in Tikrit, 2016. Sustained fire. She was bleeding. She didn't stop. Danny's face went white. Senior Chief. The title hung there. The rank. The recognition. A Coast Guard captain named James Rourke arrived for Hayes's official debrief 5 minutes later, walking into the cluster of people around the bed with the bearing of someone accustomed to certainty. He heard Hayes's words and stepped forward, his voice shifting into something formal and immobile. Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, formerly attached to Joint Special Operations Task Force, Tikrit Compound Evacuation, 14 lives saved under sustained fire, 2016. Rourke turned to Sterling. His eyes were the color of storm water. Doctor, do you understand who you suspended? Sterling's face drained of color like someone had pulled a plug. Hayes, gaining strength with every word, his oxygen saturation steady at 96, continued. Bronze Star with Valor. She received a Bronze Star with Valor. And a Navy Cross recommendation. This woman is why I'm alive. Then and now. Rachel Hayes stood beside the bed, both hands covering her mouth. When she lowered them, her eyes had changed. "You saved him?" she asked. "In Iraq?" "You saved him in Iraq." Danny's voice cracked completely. "Mom, you never said anything. You never told me you." Megan's hand shook so badly she dropped the chart. It fell with a sound like breaking glass on the tile floor. The sound echoed. Kelly, the nurse who'd called her at 0200, stepped into the hallway and whispered to another nurse who'd just arrived for her shift, "That's the Reaper. The actual Reaper. She's been working trauma here for 3 years and nobody knew. She's the one who pulled out the commander in Tikrit." Within an hour, the story spread through Mercy General Norfolk like fire through dry grass. Not the official story. Not the HR story or the peer review story. The real story. The truth. Megan O'Brien wasn't a nurse who'd overstepped her license. She was a senior chief petty officer who'd spent 8 years building a quiet life in a trauma bay, asking nothing, expecting nothing, and Sterling had tried to destroy her for the crime of being competent. The room went dead silent. At 0200 hours, while Commander Hayes slept under sedation in the ICU, the hospital corridors hummed with their mechanical indifference. Nurses changed 4 bags. Monitors beeped their steady rhythm. The security cameras in that unit ran on the same eternal loop they always did, recording everything, forgetting nothing. Dr. Sterling knew this. He also knew that footage could be deleted. At 0215, he walked into the hospital IT department on the ground floor, his white coat still crisp from the morning, his face composed in that mask of administrative concern he'd perfected over 2 decades. He found Kowalski at his desk, a Marine veteran with a shaved head and USMC insignia tattooed across his forearm, a man who'd spent for years in signals intelligence before trading combat boots for server maintenance. Sterling had never bothered to learn this. He saw only a technician, someone to direct, someone beneath the hierarchy he'd spent his career climbing. "I need a favor," Sterling said, not asked. The tone was command, not request. Kowalski looked up from his monitors. The fluorescent light above him flickered once, a sound like electricity questioning itself. Security footage from ICU, 0200 to 0300 this morning, Sterling continued. System malfunction. Needs to be purged before anyone sees corrupted files. Hospital policy on data integrity, you understand. The lie was efficient. Professional. Almost believable. Kowalski didn't move. His eyes, the color of slate after rain, stayed level with Sterling's. In that silence, something shifted. A man who'd spent for years reading encrypted communications for patterns knows how to recognize when someone is encoding the truth badly. "I'll handle it, Doctor," Kowalski said. Sterling left, believing he'd been obeyed. Instead, Kowalski did something else entirely. He pulled the ICU footage from the archive, not deleting it, but preserving it. He burned it to a USB drive. He added timestamps, file metadata, and a written statement describing the deletion request. He documented what Sterling had asked him to do, what he'd been asked to hide, and what that hiding meant. A Marine doesn't need explicit instructions to recognize when someone's trying to destroy evidence of heroism. Kowalski had seen it in combat zones, the way some men tried to erase the impossible things other men did. He wasn't going to let that happen in a hospital corridor. At 1600, Kowalski walked into Administrator Vaughan's office with the USB drive in his hand. The air in that room smelled like expensive cologne and old leather, the scent of institutional power accumulating in the same chair for 7 years. "Sir, Dr. Sterling asked me to delete security footage from the ICU," Kowalski said. He didn't sit. "Requested it as a system malfunction. I need to report that." Vaughan's expression shifted from routine administration to something sharper. "When?" "This morning. 0215 hours. He specifically asked for ICU footage between 0200 and 0300. Vaughan took the drive. His hands, soft and unmarked by anything except pens and signature pages, held it like it might detonate. He plugged it into his computer. The footage filled his screen, Megan's hands moving with the precision of someone who'd done this in conditions far worse than a climate-controlled ICU. The steady voice. The pressure curve flattening. The monitor returning to sinus rhythm. Hayes's vital signs climbing from catastrophe to stability. Jesus Christ, Vaughan whispered. His power, his career, his entire institutional architecture was suddenly in the hands of a Marine with a conscience and a USB drive. You didn't delete anything. No, sir. As a Marine, I recognize what this is. It's evidence. And someone was trying to make it disappear. By 1800, the emergency board session had convened in the hospital's administrative conference room on the 5th floor. The mahogany table reflected the faces of 5 board members: Vaughan, Patricia Lowe, 3 others whose names would fade from the story once they made the decision that ended Sterling's career. But the presence that dominated that room was Captain Marcus Rourke, standing in full-dress uniform, his chest a landscape of medals that meant things civilians would never fully understand. Rourke laid Megan's service record on the table. Bronze Star. Navy Cross recommendation. 3 Purple Hearts. The 2016 Tikrit compound evacuation. 14 lives. Her hand steady through enemy fire. Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien saved my officer's life, Rourke said. His voice carried the same tone he used to command operations: direct, authoritative, absolute. She did it in a hospital this morning with the same skill and composure she demonstrated in combat. Dr. Sterling attempted to terminate her for performing the exact procedure that prevented Commander Hayes's death. He then requested that evidence of her heroism be deleted from the hospital record. He paused. The silence in that room was the kind that precedes irreversible change. That's not a patient safety issue, Rourke continued. That's institutional cowardice. Patricia Lowe watched the security footage Kowalski had preserved. She saw Megan's hands. She saw Sterling's desperation in that deletion request. She'd been played, offered leverage she thought gave her control, only to discover she'd been leveraged into complicity. Her face went cold in the way of people who suddenly understand they've been manipulated by someone they trusted. Michael, she said to Sterling, whose face had gone the color of old paper. You told me this was a patient safety issue. It was, Sterling stammered. She exceeded scope of practice, She exceeded your willingness to admit she was right, Rourke interrupted. In my Navy, we call that leadership failure. By 2000 hours, Dr. Michael Sterling had been suspended pending administrative investigation. By 2015, he was in his car, hands shaking against the steering wheel, watching his chief of medicine ambitions dissolve like smoke. 3 days later, the Virginia Medical Board reviewed the case. They found no evidence to support the original complaint. They opened an investigation into Sterling's conduct instead, specifically into allegations of professional retaliation against a subordinate and attempted obstruction of hospital records. The investigation concluded 6 weeks later. Sterling resigned before they could formally recommend his license be revoked. He accepted a settlement that required him to sever all ties with the hospital system and accept a permanent mark on his professional record. And then he disappeared from the world that had rejected him, which is where most fallen men go when they can no longer bear to be seen. 6 months later, on Military Highway in Norfolk, Danny O'Brien was driving to base when he saw the sign. A folding table beneath a faded banner that read Sterling Care Insurance, Walk-ins Welcome. And behind that table, in a cheap polo shirt the color of dishwater, sat Dr. Michael Sterling. No patience. No line. No one stopping. Just Sterling handing flyers to people who wouldn't make eye contact, his face the texture of something that had been left out in the weather too long. Danny didn't stop. He just pulled over, took a photograph, sent it to his mother with one word, karma. Megan received the message in her office, the corner office on the 4th floor with her name on a brass plate beside the door. Director of Emergency Medicine, Mercy General Norfolk. On the walls behind her desk hung her framed Coast Guard unit patch, the one she'd kept sewn inside her jacket lining for 8 years, hidden like a secret that had finally become her truth. Beside it hung her bronze star in its glass case, and a photograph of her trauma team gathered for the first time since her reinstatement. She smiled at the photograph on her phone. Not the smile of revenge, something quieter than that. The smile of someone who'd walked through fire and come out the other side still whole. That evening, the trauma nurses threw a celebration in the break room, the same room that had emptied when she sat down 3 months earlier. Kelly brought cake. The junior resident who'd smirked at Sterling's write-up brought wine he couldn't afford, an apology written in the gesture. Megan stood, and the room went silent, not in fear this time, but in recognition. In the quiet acknowledgement of someone who'd proven exactly who she was. "I walked away from the military 8 years ago because I thought I'd lost myself," she said. Her voice was different now, not the deferential murmur of a nurse trying not to offend. This was the voice of someone who'd given orders in languages most of them would never hear, who'd made decisions that meant life and death, who'd bled in the dust. "I spent those years trying to be invisible. Trying to be just competent enough not to be noticed. Trying to be safe. But safety is a lie you tell yourself. You never really leave combat. You just find new battlefields." She paused. "This hospital was mine. And I'm keeping it." Danny, standing beside her in his Coast Guard dress uniform, gripped her shoulder. The gesture said everything. "I understand now. I know what you are. I'm proud of what you are." That night, Megan locked her office door. She touched the framed unit patch, her fingers tracing the thread she'd sewn into her jacket lining for 8 years, the symbol she'd hidden from the world and hidden from herself. The patch was home now. Not hidden. Displayed. Honored. She whispered something so quiet that only the darkness heard it. "You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior." She walked through the trauma bay where the night shift was starting its eternal rotation, nurses moving with precision, doctors calling orders, the organized chaos that saves lives in the small hours when most people sleep. The staff nodded as she passed. Not the deferential nods of subordinates to a supervisor, but the nods of warriors who'd learned to recognize each other. For the first time in 8 years, Megan O'Brien felt complete. Like and subscribe if you believe nurses deserve more respect. And tell me honestly, what would you have done in her shoes? I'm pinning the best answer.